Welcome to the Politics Guys. I'm Michael Baranowski, a political scientist at Northern Kentucky University. Today in the show, we'll be talking about a recently released research paper on fake news that's getting a lot of media attention. It's been featured in the New York Times, the Washington Post, BuzzFeed, the New Yorker, and a bunch of other places. The paper's title is Selective Exposure to Misinformation, Evidence from the Consumption of Fake News During the 2016 U.S. Presidential Campaign. And I'll be talking about it with one of the authors, Jason Reifler, a professor of political science at the University of Exeter in the United Kingdom. Dr. Reifler, welcome to the show.
Thank you for having me.
So first off, can you tell me how this research project came about in the first place?
So like with a lot of interesting research projects, it came about to some degree out of luck. So Andy Guess, Brendan Nyhan, and I had a study in the field. We were doing a survey, and the cool thing about the survey that we were doing, in addition to the content that we were asking, is we were able to see the websites that people were visiting. So there was a separate data component that people opted into to see, to have their web traffic recorded. So we can see what websites they're going to. And we had originally done this for something else. And then as the election was going on, and once it ended, we realized that we would be in a pretty unique position to estimate how much fake news people were visiting, what types of fake news they were visiting. Is this something that existed on both sides of the political spectrum? And so we're able to connect the survey responses to the web data, and it just allowed us to do something that was really cool. That was not what we originally planned. Sometimes it's better to be lucky. Sometimes luck is on your side.
Yeah, absolutely. So I was wondering if you could talk about that term fake news. Now, it's used obviously in a variety of different ways by different people. And as a social scientist, one of my first questions is how do you define your operationalize your variables? And so I'm sure that was a main issue for you. So could you explain how you defined fake news for the purposes of your study?
Yes. So when we're talking about fake news, what we really mean here is fictitious or wholly fictitious content that is produced strictly for profit without any regard to journalistic standards or truth or anything like that. So it can range from the totally hyperbolic, sort of outrageous partisan claims to just some of the most extreme outright falsehoods. The Denver Guardian DNC murder conspiracy, or Pizzagate. Actually, Pizzagate might be a kind of a tricky one. But but what we're not including in fake news is the hyper partisan websites that are still doing to some degree of informing. So one of the really hard borderline cases in our study is Breitbart.com. And we don't count Breitbart as fake news. We've estimated it looking at Breitbart, including it, and it doesn't change our results substantively. But so in terms of how we come up with a definition, we actually do it two different ways. And the results are nearly identical between the two different ways. The first way that we define what counts as fake news is just directly replicating what Alcott and Gentzkow did in their article about fake news. And they do it by starting with fact checks by Snopes.com and PolitiFact, and looking at the websites that are making false claims and sort of building out a universe of domains from there that start with specific claims that have been fact-checked and been found as false. The other way that we do it is we start with a list of websites that Craig Silverman, a reporter for BuzzFeed, has been tracking, and just looking at the websites that he says are the purveyors of fake news. And using either of these approaches, a universe that starts with fact checks, like following Alcon and Ginskow, or starting with the domains that sort of the best reporter working on the fake news beat, maybe the only reporter working on the fake news beat, but his work is really awesome. And Craig's doing a really fantastic job on this. It's sort of the ones that, it's the guy who's reading this as part of his job. What he says is the fake news. In a perfect world, we would be able to go out and code every single website out there relative to ground truth and be able to decide whether it's fake or not fake and how true or how fake it is.
Yeah.
But
a huge job.
We unfortunately do not have the coders available
Yeah.
to code every website in existence.
Right.
Although some reviewers have asked us to do that.
Jeez. Okay. So what were your key findings?
So our key findings are, first and foremost, that Americans consumed a non-trivial amount of fake news. That our estimate is that 25% of the public visited at least one fake news website in October 2016. And that the mean number of fake news articles that somebody read was 5.5, and that of the 5.5 articles that people read, 5, or about 90%, were pro-Trump in orientation. And how we conceptually think about 1/4 of the electorate visiting fake news I think is slightly tricky. So on the one hand, that's a really large number, and that's really scary. On the other hand, it means 3/4 of the public is not visiting fake news. And so that's maybe a lot more comforting. I think that over the course of working on this project for about the last year, that Andy, Brendan, and I have sort of changed our interpretation of what the data mean. I think when we first looked at it, we were like, "Oh my God, this is terrible," and this is the end of the world as we know it. That's an exaggeration. I think that we were normatively very, very scared by it. I think that now we remain nervous, but I think that our level of panic is dramatically less.
Well,
now
that's encouraging, definitely, I would say. So I wanted to ask you about that, because one thing that a lot of people are concerned about is, I guess, there's this idea, right, that if you are exposed to fake news, it's going to influence your views. But it seems to me, isn't it sort of a two-step process in that you have to be exposed to the fake news, but that doesn't necessarily mean that fake news is going to alter your perception or alter your vote choice, right?
I think that's right. And this is the thing that's really, really tricky to try and figure out. And unfortunately, our data don't answer this question. Our data tell us whether people have visited a fake news website. It doesn't tell us the extent to which it changes their vote. It doesn't tell us if it changes how much they like one candidate versus another. It doesn't tell us whether they're more or less excited about the election. It doesn't tell us what they then post on Facebook that their friends might see, or what they might say to their friends in real life. It doesn't tell us how it changes how they talk about politics with their friends and family. But I think what it does tell us is that people are interested in this kind of content, at least on the margins. But they might be interested in it because they really agree with it, and I'll elaborate on that point in a moment. But then there are also people who, I just take myself as an example. I think everybody has a relative that is as far on the other side of the political spectrum as they are. And when they post something political, sometimes you click into it just to see just to keep tabs on what they're posting, to see if it's worth taking the time to argue about it with them on Facebook. And so if I were in the data set that we have, I would come up as one of the people who clicked on a piece of pro-Trump fake news, because I have a very conservative relative who posts pro-conservative, pro-Republican things, some of which are more factually challenged than others. And every now and then I click in to see why it's wrong. And I'm sure he does some of that with me too. At least I think he does. And so I think that there is, people might consume fake news for different reasons. And to think that it changed the outcome of the election, we would have to think that individual pieces of fake news have really just had overwhelming amounts of influence, much larger than we would think we would see in like an individual television commercial, which, we think that any one TV ad in an election campaign, particularly a presidential election campaign where there's so much information from so many other sources, that it's just unlikely to move the needle that much. Now, it doesn't mean that it didn't. Our paper doesn't say one way or the other. I think that what I interpret from the data is that it's pretty unlikely that fake news changed the outcome of the election. But that isn't not the same thing as saying it's not a problem and therefore we don't have to worry about it.
Right. Now, it becomes more of an issue, more of a problem, right, when elections are closer, because these effects we're only going to probably see a change at the margins, and so the closer the result is, the more likely that something could be the kind of a tipping point.
Yes. Yeah. In politics, things are always on the margins in politics, but so one of the other things that we found that I think is really important and interesting is that we did see big differences in who was consuming fake news, in that it was Trump supporters who were largely consuming more fake news, and the fake news they were consuming was pro-Trump fake news. But it wasn't just Trump supporters generally. It really was the group of people that already had the most conservative media diets overall. So because we had their web traffic data, we can see what websites are people going to generally to get information about politics. And we can now say how conservative or liberal their overall information diet is. And the fake news consumption is really overwhelmingly concentrated in the group of people that have the most conservative media diets. So these are people who were already going to vote for Trump, almost certainly. There were not a large number of Hillary Clinton voters in the people who are consuming the highest amounts of conservative media. So, and that is another reason why, at least I think that this probably didn't change the outcome of the election. That these are the people who were already likely to vote for Trump. And these are the people who were, in particular, I think, very engaged in the election and engaged in politics because they were consuming a lot of politically oriented media. So it's the people who were already interested and were likely to vote and had probably made up their mind who they were going to vote for, at least in terms of it not being Hillary, before the primaries even started.
I wanted to ask you a little bit about fact checking, because a lot of people say that the answer to minimizing the negative effects, whatever they are, of fake news is for better and more consistent fact checking. And I'm wondering, how effective is your sense has fact checking been?
So I'm going to give the typical Weasley academic nuanced answer.
Okay.
And so the first part is, I think fact checking is hugely important. I think that it plays a vital and valuable role in political discourse. I think that it does help inform voters. Um, Again, these, as we talked about before, these things are on the margins. It doesn't reach everybody, um, but it matters on the margins. There's some evidence that fact checking limits the degree to which politicians will actively try and mislead. So fact checking serves as an important constraint or check on politicians who want to mislead, and it helps voters. I think it helps shape sort of larger media narratives. I think it gives um, important source material to reporters who are covering a race and trying to make decisions about what candidate statements should and should not be included in the articles they write up and how they write about things. So I think fact checking is hugely important and hugely valuable. Again, it works on the margins. There's no single intervention that is going to be a panacea and put us into a utopian ideal of democratic citizenship, where everybody is perfectly informed and listens to arguments of the other side, and that we engage only with reason and are not clouded by emotions. That's an unreasonable standard to hold to measure whether fact checking is working. To say, is it make everything perfect? And so I think in that regard, I think it's really, really valuable. Where fact checking has not been able to show that it is super helpful or effective yet is that what our study shows is that people are not reading fact checks about the fake news that they consume. So if somebody is consuming fake news, we don't see them then checking whether that claim is true or false by going to fact checks about that fake news. That we don't see that. But fact checks are also really valuable in terms of if it's something that, so using that example of, is it something that I want to take my time to argue about with my relatives that I strongly disagree with on politics? Does it give me something that I can point to that can be in our online discussion and say, well, here's what has actually been said. And that probably won't influence him. But all of our relatives who are seeing us bicker back and forth on Facebook, it might influence some of them, and it might play a role in the conclusions that they reach. So I do think that the fact checking is really important. A line that I'm stealing from one of my co-authors, Brendan Nyhan, is that the test of fact checking is not, does it end all lying? That's an unreasonable standard, and it's hard to measure the effect of fact checking, particularly as a constraint on politicians, because you can never measure the lies that aren't told because of fact checking.
Right. That's a good point. Yeah. One thing, and you mentioned stealing something from Brendan. I think there's a line of research, and I think he might have contributed to this as well, suggesting that sometimes actually presenting strong partisans with fact check information, demonstrating that their candidate or their view is incorrect, it might actually have a sort of a backfire sort of effect in some instances, right?
Yeah, so that's a paper that Brendan and I did that was published in 2010. And we have found effects like that in a number of different examples. And sort of the example that comes from the first study that we did along these lines looked at if we were curious why people continued to say that there were weapons of mass destruction in Iraq, even after the U.S. government had said, well, actually, it turns out we were wrong. There weren't really any weapons of mass destruction there. And so we did an experiment. And one of the things that we found was that if we gave corrective information to the most conservative subjects in an experiment, that they actually said that they were more likely to say that Iraq had WMD compared to a control condition that didn't receive corrective information. But I think there's so this happens sometimes, but I think there's also some really, really important sort of follow-up to that, which is we don't always find that. In fact, in that original paper from 2010, we had a total of 5 different experiments that we did, and we only found a backfire effect in 2 out of the 5. So it would seem to me that an absolute top a top end estimate of how often this happens is 40%. And we've done some subsequent studies, and some other people, Ethan Porter of GW and Tom Wood of Ohio State, have done a big paper suggesting that they actually find in a very large study that this happens fairly infrequently. And so I think there's actually a lot of exciting work being done right now to see exactly how often this happens, the context under which it happens, who exactly it happens with. And so the final word on this is I think we're still learning a lot. And this is one of the reasons why Brendan and I both think that fact checking is important, is that some of the other work that we've shown says that, well, actually giving people information can have a positive effect. You don't always get that backfire effect like we saw in the one study.
Well, that's encouraging. So much in media studies and media and politics seems so negative. It's nice to hear something that at least gives me some ground for hope. And I wanted to ask you, because it seems like so much of the political information people get and the fake news people get comes through social media and Facebook, and that it seems to me that part of a solution to getting that information in front of people, it would have to go through that same channel if that's where they're getting their their news stories in the first place, right?
Yeah. So I think that we all have some degree of responsibility of when we're engaging with people on Facebook and in other channels to make sure that we're spreading accurate information. It's very easy to want to share or post articles that we agree with because we agree with the underlying sentiment, even when we know that there may be it may not be perfectly accurate. And I just think we have to resist doing that. It's hard to persuade other people. Whatever side of the aisle on, and whatever, therefore, opposite side of the aisle on your proverbial crazy uncle is on, you're probably not going to convince them. And sort of my hope is I would love to see more civil political discourse. I know that sounds sort of Pollyannish, and I'm not used to being the guy who delivers the optimistic news. Maybe that's a sign of how dark things have become. That I'm the voice of optimism.
But along those areas, I mean, there actually have been, I seem to recall, some studies, some small experiments finding that depending on how you set up conversations between people of different ideological views, you actually can at least maybe not change views, but at least reach greater understanding depending on how that whole thing is carried out. Obviously, if you respond to someone's post on Facebook saying, "You ignorant idiot," that's not going to work. But there are ways to do this, right?
Yes, I think there are. And we're trying to design some new studies to sort of follow up on that too. And I yes, there's work that shows that, how we talk about things matters, and that there are possibilities. And if we could, I think take some of the heat out of politics, we would all be better off. I mean, I'm sure you teach this to your students that if you teach a campaigns course or an intro to American politics course, that politicians are just trained in trying to communicate their message to present as stark a contrast to voters as they possibly can. This election offers a clear choice, and the choice is what I offer, which is good times, and what my opponent offers, which is a post-apocalyptic hellscape.
Right, exactly, sure. Well.
And I wish we could take that, and I understand why they do that. And if I were one of their advisors, that's probably exactly what I would be telling them as well. But I really wish that we could, take the heat down a bit. But in the same time, we live in times where that, you know,
Yeah,
that's
it's
hard to
very
do.
difficult. Well, speaking specifically about the 2016 election, I'm wondering if you have any sense or any feel for how generalizable these your findings were. I mean, I'm wondering, with so many things, Donald Trump is sort of an American original. And so I'm wondering if this could be maybe just sort of a Trump one-off type of phenomena, or do you think it's really part of something that's far more pervasive and that we're likely to see in future elections, even those that don't, feature Donald Trump?
Um, I think that's a really good question and a really important one, and I probably don't have as good an answer as that question deserves. I think that in Trump, we have seen a political figure that is just not bound by the norms that we have assumed that politicians would be bound by. Um, and I think that, so how much of this is Trump? Do I think, so imagine a counterfactual in which Ted Cruz is the nominee instead of Donald Trump. Do I think that the same interference in terms of creating a social media landscape that was anti-Clinton would have existed, and that some of the same fake news might have sprung up even without Trump? I think that probably it would have gotten the same platform. I have no idea. Do I think that and what I don't have a particularly good sense of is, are future politicians going to continue to be bound by sort of historical norms of what is appropriate or what people are willing to say or not say? And then I think there's a really open question of how the public as a whole responds to politicians that are just have almost no filter when it comes to misinformation. Certainly lots and lots of previous politicians and presidents have said things that aren't accurate or have used clever wording and nuance to slightly mislead, to say things, to dissemble and say things that are technically true, but that what you infer is something slightly different and isn't true, and the inference isn't true. Trump's willingness to engage in much more wholesale untruths is, I mean, it really is unprecedented. And how other elites respond and how the American public responds in terms of what they listen to and how they trust politicians. And if there just reaches a point where whatever he says is not believed, even when it is true, or if it's true, these are just larger questions that I don't think anybody has a good handle on. If there's any one lesson I'm going to take away from 2016, it's that I'm going to try not to predict the future.
Yeah. Without, I mean, and certainly I think it's easy to paint a scenario where you can see it going either way. Really, doesn't seem that implausible to me.
Yeah, I wish that the response would be, we can do better, and we have to do better because our ability to be a self-governing democracy or republic is on the line, and I think that the stakes are potentially that high, and we all have to play a role in making things better.
Definitely. There's just one final question for you. So, what advice, if any, do you have for listeners who, want to minimize their exposure, their consumption of fake news, or want to be as smart as possible in terms of determining what's fake and what's not? Any suggestions?
I mean, I think there are a few simple ones. The first is just essentially one of the questions you asked, which is, if you're not sure, Google it and fact check it. If it seems like it probably is not true, there's a good chance it's not. and use fact checking. Use PolitiFact. Use Washington Post fact checker. Use factcheck.org. Use Snopes.com. The Snopes.com has actually probably done the most on fake news. Because since a lot of that was internet based, and a lot of what they did was looking at internet based rumors, it makes sense that they would do sort of the most on this. So don't be afraid to fact check. I think another is, the most outlandish claims are almost certainly not true. Whenever a major political figure is being accused of things like murder, it's just to start with the default that it's probably not true. And having healthy skepticism, not just about your side. So when somebody criticizes your side, you have a skepticism, but also have a skepticism when people are criticizing the people that you think are worthy of criticizing. And so, when you have people in the political spectrum that you disagree with, critique them on real grounds. On we can have political disagreements and political debate about what policies should be, what the direction of the country should be in different ways, and let's have the debate on those grounds and not over things that simply aren't true. And I think more than anything else is just trying to find a way to be respectful of our fellow human beings. And it's not it's not always easy, but just some basic kindness and respect can go a long way.
Amen. I mean, starting from the assumption that your opponent is evil and wants to destroy the country is probably not going to get you very far.
Yes, and it almost certainly isn't true.
Yeah, exactly.
I may have very strong policy disagreements with some members of Congress, but I don't think that they fundamentally hate the country. They just have a different vision of what they would like policy to be.
Amen. All right. Well, thank you so much, Dr. Jason Reifler. I really appreciate you taking the time to come on the show and talk to me about your research.
Well, thank you for having me. It's been fun.
That's it for this episode. Thanks for listening. Support from listeners just like you is what keeps the show going, and we truly do appreciate it. If you're interested in joining our great group of Politics Guys supporters, you can go to politicsguys.com and click on the Patreon or PayPal links you'll see there. And if you want to support the show without spending anything, you can subscribe to the podcast on iTunes, Pocket Cast, Stitcher, or whatever other podcast app you use. Share this episode with your friends and followers, and pass along our new show posts and tweets on Facebook and Twitter. Leaving reviews and ratings on iTunes also helps. If you've got a question, comment, correction, or just a random thought you want to share with us, you can reach us at mail@politicsguys.com. Our Facebook page, where you can message us and where we post things throughout the week, is facebook.com/politicsguyspage. We're also on Twitter @politicsguys. The executive producers of the Politics Guys are Michael Baranowski, Jay Carson, Trey Orndorff, and Bruce Johnson. Today's show was produced by Michael Baranowski. We'll be back with a new show on Saturday. We hope you'll join us.